Hi, guys. Rebecca has asked me to talk to you about script writing, sketch writing, because during our 14 years in ministry, I was the writer of the sketches that we performed. Um, One of the first things you have to understand when you start talking about creating a sketch is how you want that sketch to function. And there are basically two models of how a sketch can work in a worship service or a ministry event. First of all, it can be a standalone piece, a piece designed to be performed by itself, self contained. It's got a beginning, a middle, an end. It delivers the sermon, it presents the message. There was another model, or there is another model, that we always labeled the Willow Creek model because it was perfected by Steve Peterson and the folks at Willow Creek during the 80s and 90s. And that is a sketch that serves as a jumping off point for a sermon. It introduces an idea, it introduces a conflict or a struggle, but there is no scriptural answer given to the question. The script's point is to arouse your imagination and to provide a starting point for a sermon. The pastor or the teacher then comes and examines scripture and finds out what the Bible has to say about resolving the issue or answering the question raised by the sketch. It's very important to know how your script is going to function. If it's going to be a standalone piece, then you need to raise a theological question or a theological concept, but you've also got to answer it. You've got to come up with a resolution and an ending that is dramatic and effective. If you're doing that Willow Creek model, you are opening up the question, but you're not providing the solution. Rebecca and I had a very unique experience when we were in ministry. We were doing a youth revival in the mid 90s at a church in Mississippi, and we were doing a drama revival, bringing the messages each night with sketches. And so we were doing standalone dramas that we had written. But the youth minister of the church wanted his church youth group to do some kind of presentation. And so they did a Willow Creek sketch on abortion. The problem is, it was a Willow Creek sketch. It required somebody to come in and follow up and give an explanation of what God had to say on the subject. And it created all kinds of conflict and stress during that week because it was being used incorrectly. There was going to be nobody to follow that sketch up with the sermon on what the Bible had to say about abortion. They didn't understand how to correctly use the script they had chosen. Now, for a sketch to be effective, for it to be powerful, whatever model you're choosing, it has to have conflict, struggle. It's the struggle that puts the action into gear. It's the conflict that drives the purpose of the sketch. And there are lots of types of conflict. You can have direct conflict between two people who want two different things. But it can be an internal conflict. It can be a character who knows in his heart he should be doing one thing, but who wants to do something else. So the conflict doesn't have to be the clear-cut physical struggle that we often associate with action dramas. It can be a more cerebral conflict, but we've got to have something that's driving the action, that's making the story move forward. Now, the next thing that a good sketch has is a sense of reality. It's real. And don't misunderstand this to mean that it has to be realistic. Many of the sketches that Rebecca and I performed when we were in ministry were very anachronistic comedic sketches based on biblical stories, but told in kind of an anachronistic fashion. And so there was a certain amount of comic fantasy involved in the sketches, but there was still emotional reality. We dealt with emotional issues, and it's that we mean by the sketch must be real. The emotions need to be profound and honest. A sketch also has to have good dialogue. That's what puts the sketch on the stage, is the dialogue that is spoken by the actors. And it needs to be realistic, it needs to be honest, but it also has to have a flair. It's got to be something you want to watch. A badly written sketch doesn't engage you with the language. A well written sketch does. Now, one of the things that Rebecca and I learned in our 14 years in ministry is that the spoken word and the written word are two different things. I wrote some things that I thought were great on paper. I mean, I'm my own best critic, but I thought there was some profound things. But once we got up and tried to speak them in rehearsal, we realized they were clunky, they were less effective than we thought they were going to be. There is a difference between what works on paper and what works coming out of an actor's mouth. Now, I had the unique blessing to be writing for two specific speakers. I mean, the sketches that I wrote over the 14 years we were in ministry were written to be performed by the two of us. And so I would write to our strengths. I knew what Rebecca could do. I knew what I could do. I knew what we could do together. And so I had the unique opportunity of writing for two specific voices. Now, over the course of the years, many people have borrowed or purchased our scripts and have performed them, and I hope have had great success with them, but I was writing not for them, but for me and Rebecca. I was writing for our ministry. The next thing that you've got to have a successful written script is that you have to have a sense of structure. Aristotle writes in the Poetics that there's got to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And each of those things have their own purpose. As a writer, you need to work from a clear sense of structure. You need to have a sense of how it's all going to work together. I teach my students in my theater appreciation course and in my playwriting courses about Freytag's pyramid and how important it is to have the different elements, that sense of something wrong at the beginning of the play, a situational imbalance, an inciting incident that sets the drama into motion, a series of conflicts that create rising action that ultimately reaches a climax and a sense of denouement as the action winds down. The next thing you need in a script, particularly a script where you're dealing with religious issues, is identification. The audience has got to be interested in and like the characters you're presenting. Again, whether it's realistic or more fantasy based. One of our favorite sketches that we performed when we were in ministry was a piece called Something Miraculous, and it tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000 from the perspective of the little boy who brings his lunch that day. And we filled that with some very comical characters, and I was often the comedic part of our duo. I would do the more humorous stuff, and Rebecca would often play the more serious. In Something Miraculous, I played the Jewish mother who insists that her son takes his lunch with him that day to this teaching session. I played the disciple Andrew who, against his better judgment, takes a little boy with a sack lunch to Jesus. Rebecca ended up playing Jesus in that sketch. And we weren't trying to make any kind of statement. She was just better at playing straight characters. I played comedic characters. And so in this case, we thought it would be more effective if she was the voice of Jesus. But there were things that people related to. There were things that they saw themselves in. And that's got to be there. If they can't see that connection, that involvement, that where they see themselves in the characters, then there's not going to be the level of involvement that you want. That involvement leads you to be able to affect change in people. It allows you to touch them on a level that allows God to work in their lives. And so the important thing, I think, is the identification. It can be serious, it can be humorous, but the audience has to be able to see themselves. During our ministry, we kind of specialized in comedic stuff. We had serious pieces, and even our comedic sketches would always end in a very serious way. But we felt that we could touch people more effectively through comedy. A sketch also needs to be filled with action, and that is characters in process, characters acting out what they're doing. And so a good sketch doesn't tell us what happens, a good sketch shows us what happens. We don't want to rely on a story being told to us by one of the characters. We want to see that conflict, that development, that action in place. One of the important issues whenever you're writing a sketch for ministry is the scriptural soundness of the sketch. Is it true to biblical principle? And for each of you, that's going to depend in some part on your own background, your own denomination, your own doctrinal beliefs. But it's going to also rely on your study of Scripture and your understanding and revelation from God. I have seen pieces in the years that Rebecca and I were in ministry that I felt were very scripturally unsound. There was a sketch we saw a church group deliver at a conference once that basically ended up saying that the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened to our country because we took prayer out of the public schools. There's no scriptural basis for that. In my view, that was an unsound and unbiblical sketch. It wasn't grounded in good doctrine. You need to understand your revelation of who God is, you understand him to be through your faith, through your denominational doctrine, through the teachings of your church. And there are variations. I mean, there are differences. The reason we have Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians is because we all believe some things that are a little different. We all share certain things, the Lordship of Christ, the church as the bride of Christ, but there are those little denominational distinctives that make us unique, and you have to understand those as a writer. One of the hardest steps of the writing process, finally, is editing. And unless you are a genius of unequaled proportion, the first thing you put on paper is not going to be what you end up with the sketch. It's going to have to develop. It's going to have to grow. It will need editing. In our ministry, I was the author. Rebecca was the editor. And I learned early on how difficult it is to turn your writing over to someone and say, what do you think needs fixing? One of the first things I learned was never to hand her a script that I had just finished. This was early in our marriage, our kids were young, and I would often stay up late till 2 or 3 in the morning writing, and then I would wake her up to give her a script. Not a good idea. Later in our ministry, I learned that if I let it sit for a while and then give it to her, I'm not as emotionally attached to it. She can be more objective in her critiquing of it and in her editing of it. Another thing we learned in that editing process is generally, at least in our process, probably about a third of what happens in the text is going to get cut during the editing process. We had 1 or 2 exceptions where I would sit down and write a piece, and when we got through with it, except for a couple of tweaks here and there, it was finished. The piece I mentioned earlier about the feeding of the 5,000 was one of those. We did a piece about Hosea and Gomer called Love Story that I sat down and did basically at one sitting. But those were rare. I probably, over the course of our ministry, wrote 75 to 80 sketches, and many of those were painfully long processes where we would sit down and battle out what needed to be changed or fixed or edited. The writing process isn't easy, and finding someone you can trust to be your editor is a very important step in the success of that career as a writer.